Hello, my name is Jesse Rivera, and this is my final research project for U.S. History 530 at Liberty University with Dr. Schultz, and it is Religion and its Impact on the Founding Fathers. The topic of this research is intended to find out how the individual religion of the Founding Fathers impacted them and their contribution to our country. So my research question is intended to find out, again, how the individual religion of the Founding Fathers impacted their contributions to the founding of our country, and also looking at several precedents that were made by them that still exist and carry on today. The first founding father that I looked at was George Washington, and Baumgartner's book, From Washington to Jefferson, he talks about how Washington attended a lot of different churches, especially during his time in the military and traveling around the country, but the church he primarily attended was an Anglican church. Washington himself, typically when speaking of God, he used the word providence, and he used that for a long part of his public life. The picture that is on this slideshow is of Washington at the first inauguration, and a couple significant things in this that are being portrayed here is Washington putting his hand on the Bible and being sworn in. And we'll later talk on in this presentation about the significance of the Bible to the founders, and also its place in some significant public events such as inauguration. Washington, like many of the founders, lived complex lives. Their religious beliefs attached to their public life maybe didn't always match up, and Washington himself owned lots of slaves. The other book that is referenced on this slide is Faith Before Creed, and again it talks about kind of the complexities in Washington's religious life and about his beliefs and some things that he's commented on throughout his public career about the importance of providence to him personally, and also in the long-term health and prosperity of our nation. Jefferson, his religious beliefs most closely tied to deism. He had significant contradictions as well in his personal and public life. One of the things that I found most interesting in doing this research, there is a lot of existing research on this topic, and one of the areas that they really do focus on are the founders and these contradictions that exist. So Jefferson, of course, is famously remembered for penning the Declaration of Independence, the letter to the Danbury Baptist Church, which will be discussed a little bit later in more detail, and the statutes for Virginia for religious freedom. And while he wrote some words and phrases that are remembered in American history very vividly, he himself was a slave owner. Upon his death, only freed some of his slaves. In John Hersey's book, Words and Deeds by Jefferson, he examines some of these contradictions about talking about inalienable rights and all men are created equal, and Jefferson's views on slavery and kind of the contemporary view of the time for women. Jefferson, in regards to his religion, was pretty interesting. Maybe the most interesting of all the founders. He was well read in a wide variety of topics, to include the Bible. But Jefferson actually edits the Bible himself, which is quite an undertaking. And he actually edits the New Testament. And in doing so, Peter Carlson, in The Bible According to Thomas Jefferson, talks about how Jefferson goes through and cuts out portions of the Bible, where it talks about miracles or supernatural things happening. And at the end, what Carlson discusses is how Jefferson says it is like the purest moral code to man, removing the supernatural aspects of the New Testament. Jefferson was very common in the time of the beliefs of the importance of the moral code in the Bible and the moral code that Jesus taught. His beliefs for the rest of the Bible and the rest of Christianity may have been a little bit different than the common beliefs of the time, but he really focused on the teachings of Jesus and the principles in Christianity, and he thought that that was the best moral code that you could have. John Adams was a Unitarian. Adams was a very strong advocate and very outspoken for his Christian faith. And Wilson McWilliams' book, Religion and the American Founding, he talks a lot about Adams really throughout his whole life, religion, Christianity, again, that Christian moral code really being a focus of his, as he's talking about being an advocate for freedom of religion, just as Jefferson was. And Adams is one of the founders that never owned a slave, so he didn't have those contradictions, and he, of course, grew up in the Massachusetts area and was an abolitionist and was looking for rights for his man, and he believed that while America was not a Christian country, again, he believed in that moral code and believed that that was what was going to put our country on a path to be successful long term. Next one is James Madison and Joseph LeConte's book, Faith in the Founding, the influences of religion on politics of James Madison. He discussed how Madison, one of the things that was unique with Madison is that he was not maybe as religious as a lot of his contemporaries. He does advocate for some of those Christian principles that his contemporaries did. He is remembered as the father of the Constitution, and of course one of the big things that comes out of this is religious freedom, and that is something that he himself was a very strong advocate for. Gary Kowalski talked about that in his book as well, Revolutionary Spirits, and how one of the things Madison really was pushing for was that the federal government was not going to establish an official religion, and that he wanted people to have those individual liberties and freedoms to worship as they wanted. Again, Madison was another rich Virginia planter, and he, just like Jefferson and just like Washington, was a slave owner himself. Ben Franklin is another one who his religion, and a lot of the founders as well, their religions of what they were born as, and as their life progressed, their religious kind of affiliations progressed as well. And Franklin is another one that most people would describe as a deist. Something that I thought was particularly interesting in doing the research for this project, and I already heard of it, but it was interesting just to get a little more background through the research, is Franklin proposed to start the Constitutional Convention with prayer, talking about kind of the lack of progress that was made, and saying that maybe getting some help from the Almighty will help them progress through with the Constitutional Convention and have some success with what they were working on. Two of the books that I read kind of referenced Franklin and his religious beliefs and how they impacted his political leanings and things that he did, and one was Wilson McWilliams, again, Religion and the American Founding, and the other was Daniel Dreisbach, Reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers, and they both talked about how Franklin maybe wasn't the most religious of the Founding Fathers, but he, just like all the others, had a very deep-rooted belief in the Christian moral code, and that was really what was was motivating him in founding of this country, to make sure that those principles were set forth and preserved in our country. The Bible, there was a book that I read and mentioned it earlier, Daniel Dreisbach, reading the Bible with the Founding Fathers, and in that it talks about the place that the Bible has played throughout the history of our country, which I thought was an interesting aspect, maybe a little bit different than looking specifically at the Founding Fathers, but a book that's obviously vitally important to Christians. And a lot of the Founding Fathers, as I said before, their religious affiliations progressed and changed throughout their livelihoods, from the churches that they were raised in to what they ultimately were in adulthood and their later years in life. But even if their denominations changed, the principles in Scripture is what they advocated for, and what ultimately ends up being a bedrock foundation in the founding of this country. The Bible, even for people that weren't maybe strict traditionalists of Christian philosophy, the Bible was very widely read among the founders. There was volumes of literature of a great variety of the founders quoting Scripture, referencing back to it. So this was a book that the Founding Fathers were very familiar with, knew the principles, and understood the teachings of Jesus, and were looking to apply that in, again, the founding of this country. The Bible then, in this book by Dreisbach, he then goes on to talk about, again, the role that the Bible plays. And one of the things that was discussed too was what it does in some of the ceremonies. So earlier on, there was a picture of Washington signing, getting sworn in his first inauguration, and of course his hands on the Bible. The Bible is used in court. It's used in all inaugurations. So a very centerpiece to a lot of important American services. The Declaration of Independence, I read an article, it was titled "In Good Faith, in Goodwill," and it talks about how there's a lot of Christian moral code that can be found in the Declaration. The Declaration itself references God as the Creator, but it references Him several times in there, and also discusses divine providence. It discusses how the Creator gives inalienable rights and natural laws. And again, this is the work of the original small committee, Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson, who were discussed previously. And you can definitely see the influence of religion. You can see their understanding of Scripture. You can see their understanding of Jesus' teachings and principles, and see how they were trying to implement that into the independence of a new country, and then ultimately the creation of a new government. Another important part in religion early on, especially talking about the Founding Fathers, is the idea of the separation of church and state. There's a couple books that I read that talked about this, and really they all heavily focus on Jefferson's letter to the Danbury Baptist Church. In this letter, this is where Jefferson makes this famous metaphor of separation of church and state. What I found interesting in the books that I've read, that it is still debated to this day of what Jefferson's true intent was. Derek Davis, he wrote Thomas Jefferson and the Wall of Separation, and in his book he discussed that he does not believe that Jefferson was calling for an absolute strict separation of both, but rather that Jefferson wanted a separation, but that there would still be times that the two groups would have areas that overlap and work together at times. So Crasson, again, in his book, he discussed some of the controversy and some of the different interpretations for Jefferson's writing this letter as well. So that was one thing that I thought was particularly interesting, the ongoing controversy and kind of research going on into the intent of what Jefferson says. And again, there's sides that argue both with them. And Jefferson, again, when you talk about having some of these contradictions, he still advocates for freedom of religion and individual human rights very strongly throughout his political career. So one of the things I've talked about on the slides before are the contradictions that you find in the Founding Fathers. Donald Shearer, he wrote an article, God and the Founding Fathers. In this article, he broadly paints a picture of the founders in general, and he says that people like to put people in categories, that they're a Protestant or Presbyterian or different denominations like that, and what they believe. What Shearer argued, and this was in 1943 when he writes this article, is that these were very complex men. They were inspired by the Enlightenment, but they were also very well read in Christian scripture. Most of them were raised in very religious houses. So you have the balancing of ideals of the Enlightenment with being brought up in traditional Christian households and what that plays out to in their life. So he talked about what this looked like in practice with people such as Jefferson, Madison, Washington, advocating for equality, advocating for freedoms and rights of man while they were slaveholders. So his article is pretty interesting, and just looking at some of the contradictions that many of these men who were raised devout Christians had, these contradictions in their lives. This is a brief overview of the bibliography. Thank you for watching my presentation.